Every day, the world moves on as it always has. Cities wake up, work begins, and life feels familiar. But beneath that sense of normality, something is shifting. The climate is changing, and the systems we rely on, energy, food, water, cities, finance, are under pressure in ways we're only beginning to understand. These changes don't live in reports or projections, they are already shaping people, livelihoods, and communities. We created the Climate Leadership Podcast so these challenges don't remain abstract or distant, but are explored through the people working inside these systems, making real decisions with real consequences, often without clear answers. This is not a space for fear, blame, or perfection. It's a space for honest conversations about what leadership looks like in a changing world. If you're listening, you're already part of that leadership. Let's begin the conversation.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Leadership Podcast. Today's conversation explores a critical question in climate and energy strategy. Is net zero losing momentum in a rapidly changing world? Since 2019, the global landscape has shifted with rising geopolitical tensions, fiscal pressures, and an increasing focus on energy security. Recent conflicts have reinforced how closely energy systems are tied to political stability and national priorities. At the same time, capital continues to flow into low carbon technologies, and businesses are adapting their strategy to a changing environment. So the question is not simply whether net zero is dead or alive, but whether we are entering a more complex and difficult phase of the transition. Joining us today is Mr. Adrian Del Mestro, Vice President, Global Energy Advisory at AECOM, a global infrastructure engineering consulting company who advises global clients across the energy spectrum. Thank you, Adrian, for giving us your time today.
Pleasure. Lovely to see you, Amber.
Great. So let's start. To begin our conversation, in 2019, net zero appeared to be an unstoppable global movement. From your perspective, what has fundamentally changed in the political and economic environment since then?
Thank you. Good question to start the conversation off. And first, I should say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak on your wonderful podcast. Look, 2019 feels like a really long time ago now. And those were very much the heady days of net zero. So just so that to remind people, because our memories can be a bit short sometimes, this was when the UK announced its commitment for net zero from a legal perspective. And we saw a plethora of net zero announcements from other governments and corporates. And that built up momentum during the COVID crisis. And you will also remember there was this sentiment of building back better, but greener approach to how we look after our society. And I even remember briefly NextEra, its market capitalization in the US, big renewables company, actually surpassed Exxon, and it was kind of viewed as a milestone of this is the new world that we're entering. And things have changed clearly. And I think what's happened is net zero is still a big focal point. I think decarbonization is a big focal point. But as you alluded to in your introduction, the world has become more complex from a kind of geopolitical perspective, cost of living crisis. I think this just makes it harder for governments to kind of stay rigidly on that net zero path. And if I look at, for example, the UK as an example there, you've got a cost of living crisis conversation, which was triggered by a major geopolitical event related to the invasion of Ukraine. And in the world that we're living now, that geopolitical complexity has got more complex. And as a result, governments are having to compete with a lot of competing tensions. They've got the cost of living crisis that they're having to deal with. They don't want to burden consumers with even more costs in this environment. And then with this geopolitical uncertainty, you've got many governments refocusing on defense spending, and that's another competing priority. And again, just as a data point, you look at Germany. I think by 2029, so in about 3 years' time, it will spend about 160 billion euros on defense, up from 95 billion in 2025. So a lot of these countries are having to reallocate resources, and I think that's just making it harder for net zero.
Right, right. Adrian, you mentioned something about legally binding agreements, or so are these net zero targets legally binding? Can someone sue the UK government if they don't reach that target?
It's a good question. So, I mean, certainly in the case of the UK and some of these other governments, these are enshrined in law. And there are conversations, again, in the UK, there are conversations about changing that. And again, we can understand why some governments or why some parties are pushing for that. And again, going back to that geopolitical perspective, there's this rise of populist politics, which frankly doesn't really like ambiguity and nuance. They just like simple answers, and therefore there's a view out there that we can just simply retract from these commitments, and everything will be easier for consumers. And that's a rather simplistic answer, because if you just think about just part the legality of it, we've started on a journey, and there's an enormous amount of investment that is flowing into decarbonization. And sometimes people forget this. Last year, and I think this is BNEF, Bloomberg New Energy Finance data, something like $2.1 trillion was invested in low carbon technologies, everything from renewables, nuclear, solar, wind, etc. Investors invest that money because they see a long-term trend, they see a stable government policy and expectation of what the end goal is. If you start changing the laws of the land, if you start changing policy dramatically and going in the opposite direction, that's not what investors like. And I think there's significant repercussions if we go down that route.
Right. So we are now operating in a more fragmented geopolitical landscape. Has the weakening of multilateral cooperation materially affected global climate progress?
Yeah, excellent question. So I think the answer is yes and no. I think multilateralism, given the challenges we face with climate change, which is a global problem, you need a multilateral approach. Having said that, it's not as though it's been easy with multilateralism. If you look at the last few COPs, there's been a lot of criticism of that process, the requirement for a kind of unanimous view, which means there's very little room to kind of make significant advances, and therefore the announcements always tend to be watered down. So it's not been a perfect process, but I think there's definitely the way forward is multilateralism. That's obviously got harder in the last few years. If we look across the pond from us in the UK, there's a new administration that's withdrawn the US from the Paris Accords, has disrupted international decarbonization initiatives. Think of what happened with the IMO and decarbonization of shipping. Having said that, you still see significant progress. So if you look at even in the US, just look at what's happening in Texas, which is, their oil and gas capital. It's also a major renewables hub. And I think recently Texas actually produced more utility scale solar power generation than California. So at the state level, you're seeing progress there. You're seeing significant progress by the likes of China. Again, people are not quite aware of the scale of investment China makes in low carbon. It still has obviously investments in coal power generation, but its investment in solar and wind is totaling something like $800 billion last year, and it's much bigger than all the other countries around the world. So there's significant headway there, and you're seeing progress again in the big areas of decarbonization. So predominantly power and light vehicle transport. So power generation globally, I think, has reached kind of 40% decarbonization. Again, if you look at some countries like the UK, we're over 50% now. So really strong progress there. Electric vehicle sales, really positive momentum there. Again, half the cars sold in China are electric vehicles. And I think given what's happening recently with some of the Middle Eastern turmoil, you'll see an acceleration of those trends. Having said that, the hardest bits of decarbonization still remain. So heating is still very difficult to decarbonize and heavy industry. But I think the general trajectory is still positive. The pace has probably slowed down a bit. And even though we might not be eliciting the most optimal benefits from a multilateral approach, individual countries are still making a significant contribution. And there's a desire among some of these countries to still cooperate. It's just that pace has slowed down a bit.
Right. So, Adrian, like ATM period also, we talk and we talk to each other and professors, right? So they say that in conferences like IPCC or COP, we need a lot of interdependent communication, a lot of collaboration among different countries. And as you see, the world is moving from interdependency towards protectionism, right? Countries are looking inside rather than collaborating. So, do you think that is impacting in the current state, and will moving forward will that change?
Yeah. I mean, the world's becoming, in a way, more fragmented like that. And there's a broad trend of introspection. So governments kind of looking at their own agenda, and this focus on energy security, which I'm sure we'll touch upon later in the conversation. And that seems the direction of travel, at least for the short to medium term. Having said that, I'm the eternal optimist. I'm always going to be the glass is half full. And I think, I mean, you alluded to academics. There's still international collaboration between academics. There is collaboration between business in terms of within actual countries, but also cross-border collaboration. And businesses have an international footprint, and therefore they, by their very nature, they have to collaborate to get synergies and to make progress. So I take comfort that it's a little bit like that analogy of in the US, you have the federal government and you have the state government. The
Right.
federal government might go in one direction, but the states will potentially go in another direction. And I still see that with business and academia, where there is collaboration, there's a desire to move forward. It just makes it harder, right?
Right.
In terms of there may be sources of data that are no longer available. If I think of, for example, from memory, I think with a lot of the, Russia had a big role in providing data around what was happening in the Arctic in terms of the impact of climate change. And that data is no longer officially available now. That's a valuable data source that's been taken away. But there will still be a degree of collaboration between academics and maybe with some businesses that still allow us to move forward in other regions.
Right. Okay, so recent geopolitical conflicts have brought energy security back into focus. How do such developments reshape priorities between energy security and decarbonization?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, that's probably, when you asked me earlier on about the biggest change, when I talked about those heady days of net zero, we're very much in the world of energy security now. And just to be absolutely clear, when we say energy security, if you think about that famous trilemma of security of supply, sustainability, and affordability, we've seen cycles of that. So those heady days, 2015, with the Paris Accords, the focus was on sustainability. We talked about COVID, which was focused on sustainability. Then we had the Ukraine crisis, which raised that specter, particularly of affordability, that came top of mind. But quickly on the back of that was energy security post-Ukraine. And now, given the events in the Middle East, energy security, again, top of mind. So that is very much what governments and businesses think about, because they need to make sure that they stay resilient in terms of potential disruption. And governments are really focused on keeping the lights on. And that doesn't mean that's the end of decarbonization or net zero. I think what's happening is you're seeing a more nuanced view of this. So I think it's very when I speak to clients, it's and. So I think hydrocarbons still have a role to play, but alongside and with low carbon sources. So traditional stuff like wind and solar, but also you've been witnessing a renaissance in nuclear, and there are other technologies that we can talk about later. But it's a combination. You need to have a portfolio of energy sources that are resilient against all this disruption and uncertainty that we're seeing in the market. Now, just as an aside, there's definitely an argument that's gaining currency now, which is exposure to fossil fuels means enormous volatility, and therefore we need to double down on renewables and electrification, and that's true. And you'll see added momentum in electrification, but I don't think it's binary. I don't think it's fossil fuels is bad, electrification good, and we're safe if we go, because the reality is fossil fuels will still play an important part in our energy mix. From memory, the IEA net zero scenario 2050, I think it talks about 20 million barrels a day of oil demand, even in a 2050 net zero world. So you're still going to have demand for fossil fuels, but you need to complement it with significant upscaling in renewables and low carbon. So I think the two work hand in hand. Just one other thought, and forgive me, we're skipping between global and local, but I think it's interesting. In the UK, you're seeing a big push or an argument that we need to keep our North Sea oil and gas basin going on the grounds of security of supply. Again, I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think if you keep the North Sea basin going, it's important because it generates revenue for the government that allows the government to use that revenue to deploy on electrification and decarbonization. Right. It's not necessarily going to address security supply because the gas and the oil we produce is sold on international markets. But again, it just shows how interesting how this debate around security supply is taking different angles.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Adrian, I was thinking that there are specific industries like shipping, plastics, which we use, fertilizers, and flights also, they are heavily oil dependent. So I was doing some research because of this recent conflict, and I wanted to know why oil is still such a big factor that cutting off Strait of Hormuz, making the whole world go into recession. If it's still persisted, we will have recession. So what do you think about this? That this is a big chunk which is not touched, or how do you look at this thing?
And so, Ambit, let me just are you saying why are we still so heavily dependent on oil and gas? Is that the question you're asking?
We are, we in these examples we see we are dependent.
Yeah.
But we make a picture that we are moving so fast into net zero,
Yeah. It's a good point. With the global economy, to quote a famous former president, is still addicted to oil, right? And it's something like 80% of our global energy is still based on hydrocarbons. It's come down a few percentage points, but the reality is we're still overly dependent. And then the other thing to bear in mind is, when we think about oil, for example, you may just think about petrol and diesel, but the oil is used as a feedstock to produce so many other products. If you look around in your room, the plastics, the paint on the wall, probably the layers on your kitchen cabinet are all based on petrochemical products that are derived from oil. So we have this massive dependency, and that's why it's difficult. Clearly, that's why it's difficult. But I think it's interesting to see that we are scaling up renewables significantly. I mean, I mentioned the power side of achievements. I think India last year went over the 100 gigawatt of installed capacity in solar, which was a big milestone there. I've talked about the UK, more than 50%. So you're seeing this scaling up of renewables, but the challenge is renewables is intermittent, and therefore you need somehow to make sure you manage that intermittency battery energy storage solutions, broad energy solutions will have a big role to play with that, and that will eventually scale up. You've got other technologies like nuclear, which is slightly more expensive, but a reliable baseload. Clearly, some issues around how you deal with the radioactive waste, but there's another option there, and that we need to scale up. So as these technologies scale up, and this is what gives me hope, as these technologies scale up and the innovation comes into play, we will gradually reduce that reliance, at least on oil, particularly oil for kind of transportation, for example. That you'll see that those scales shifting. But it's difficult to do it really quickly, because what you don't want to do is trigger energy security issues, because you've gone massively down the route of low carbon and renewables. And, when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, you haven't got a backup solution, which is why you've got some countries that are looking at gas as providing a bit of that base load to support renewables.
Right. So, Adrian, I was also thinking one thing, a common argument I come across. So, I might be wrong, but US is still the biggest carbon emitter in the world, followed by China, and then other country like India might also be, because these are the developing economies of the world. So, can countries grow fast on renewable energy? Like, if you see after World War II, when the industrialization was at its peak, then everyone was using fossil fuels to build themselves, right? So, can countries like India or then Indonesia or Philippines who are upcoming, or Africa who are upcoming and growing, can they grow as fast on renewable energy?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And we're already seeing, the examples of economic growth and decarbonization being decoupled. Yeah. So in terms of energy, the oil intensity being decoupled from GDP growth. And again, UK is a good example of that. China is a good example of that. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is, as these sectors grow, they generate employment and growth and capabilities. And one of the biggest challenges we have just on the energy industry is just a lack of skilled talent and a labor force. There's a large chunk of our labor force in there's the oil and gas sector, that's a chunk that's going to be retiring soon. Nuclear energy, there is a large chunk of the workforce that's retiring. So as these energies industries scale up and their capabilities scale up, there will be demand for skilled labor, and therefore that's going to add wealth to the country in terms of skills, wealth, generating more GDP. So there's a big growth opportunity out of these low carbon technologies. Having said that, and I should have probably mentioned it earlier, but it just brought in, it's an important point just to bring in again in this nuance conversation, right? We talked a little bit about exposure to fossil fuels, the geopolitical volatility, and that's something that we need to kind of mitigate, and therefore let's double down on renewables. It's important that people remember that just because we build up a renewables capability in terms of infrastructure, solar, wind, etc., that doesn't mean that geopolitical risk is reduced as well. There are other types of geopolitical risk. So the one that I would just mention briefly is if you think about clean energy supply chains, so all those critical minerals and elements that go into building that renewable infrastructure. So copper, cobalt used in batteries, for example, lithium used in batteries. A lot of those critical minerals are actually refined predominantly by China, and there'll be concerns around building up exposure to that, for example. So it's not, as I mentioned, it's not binary. It's much more nuanced in terms of exposure to geopolitical risk, even in a more renewables world.
Right. So, Adrian, do you think net zero is being quietly diluted or reframed rather than explicitly abandoned? And what signals should we be watching?
So the way I would frame it is, if you'd criticized net zero in 2019, 2020, it would have been heretical. Yeah, you would have been really an outcast. Yeah. Now it's kind of normal in terms of populist politics to point at net zero. and there are clearly negative associations of the costs incurred in order to decarbonize. Does that mean that net zero is dead? No, not at all. I think if you look at most businesses that look at a long-term perspective, the direction of travel is very clear, which is a decarbonized world, and we need to work towards that. And I think, I talked about the investment flows, investment, insurance companies, long-term pension funds, they are all looking at that long-term trajectory, and it's very clearly net zero and decarbonization. Mm-hmm. What's changing, as I mentioned earlier, is the pace. And I think we're at a difficult period now where the momentum of net zero is slowing down in some regions, and there are populist politics that are demonizing net zero. But the way I always look at it in terms of just practically, unfortunately, I'm pretty certain there'll be a series of major climate change events that will shock governments into realizing that they need to do more, right? And therefore, I hope that we realize the need to regain the momentum before those shocks happen. And in a way, the interesting thing is that these geopolitical shocks, in a way, accelerate that momentum as well. So I think we're still moving in the right direction, but the pace is going to be patchy.
Right. Yeah, this last point is something I was thinking, that today's conflict also shows our dependency on oil, and that allows governments to make a case that we should be more self-reliant on renewable energy.
Yes. Yeah. And just as another, we talked a lot about security of supply, and just another angle on this. It's interesting. So when you talk about security of supply, you talk about diversity. And the irony, if you think back, Europe was heavily dependent on Russian gas supplies, and they've tried to reverse that, given what's happened of what happened with the invasion in Ukraine. And now, ironically, one of the beneficiaries of the current conflict in the Middle East is potentially Russia being positioned as an alternative gas supplier, given the structural change that we're seeing in LNG markets. So you're seeing things kind of getting more complicated. And I think we just need to be aware that things change, and we have to, I think in terms of our strategy, we need to be fleet of foot and adapt to changes. So think of China, for example, diversified its oil imports, a big import of oil, across multiple countries, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, etc. But actually, that diversification strategy is through a choke point, which is the Strait of Hormuz. So even China, which is usually held up as a model for long-term planning, even they were caught somewhat by these events. So you're having to rethink the way you look at security supply and diversification.
Right. So thank you, Adrian, for today's conversation. So this discussion highlights that net zero is not disappearing, but evolving within a more complex geopolitical and economic context. Energy security, capital allocation, and corporate strategy are now more important as climate policy in shaping the transition. While the path forward may be slower and more fragmented, the direction remains significant for businesses, investors, and policymakers alike. Thank you for joining us on the Climate Leadership Podcast. We will be back soon with more conversations. Until then, take care and have a nice day. Bye-bye.